What dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? My uncle was actually my cousin. He was kidnapped as an infant, and when he was returned a year later, my aunt didn't want him back. My grandparents adopted him, so he was legally my uncle. My dad's first cousin is serial killer Kenneth McDuff. We saw the America's Most Wanted episode when it aired and were so surprised to hear about a McDuff, not knowing he was a relative. Not exactly dark, but I found out my father wrote porn novels under a pen name to make ends meet when I was a baby. I've been trying to find one ever since. When my grandma's gentleman friend was admitted into a care home for his dementia, they had a problem in verifying his medical records. As he deteriorated, he lost his Irish accent and would occasionally speak in German. He was a child during WW2, my parents reckon he was probably a Jewish escapee. Found out one of my close relatives was a trigger man for a crime family, was Una lived at his daughter's school functions. I was told by my aunt, before my parents thought it necessary, that my dad had cheated on my mum and slept with a stripper, and that I was her daughter and not actually my mother's. I found out years later that my dad wasn't actually my dad either, though he thought he was, which is why he put his name on my birth certificate and brought me home when my birth mother wanted nothing to do with me. Fun times. My dad took me out for a walk when I was in middle school to tell me that I have a half-brother in Japan with a similar name and birthday as me. We have the same dad, different moms. My brother has known about me his whole life, as a sister who lives in the States, but I only found out about his existence on that day. My grandpa's, stepdad's side, first wife tried to unalive him, and went to prison for it. Then also, my aunt, mom's side, was pimped out by her husband for decades. That my family's money originally came from being moonshiners during Prohibition. I grew up in Appalachia. My mom told me about being little and playing in shoeboxes full of cash. And about sitting in the back seat on late-night drives where you could hear the jars rattling in the trunk heading across the Tennessee border. My parents had 2 kids before I was born. My mother drowned them in a bathtub during a psychotic episode. Somehow, despite this a prior history of mental illness, she got released, had me a couple years later. They had another child just before I turned 2, but I never laid eyes on her. Neither of them ever fessed up, though. I only found out about their existence after an aunt died, left me her personal effects. I found birth announcements for these other kids in her mementos. I always thought she meant for me to find them. When I asked my parents, they refused to discuss anything related to these kids. My grandpa, 15, ran away with my grandma, 14, from a convent. No one even bothered looking for her thereafter, cause she was an orphan and didn't even know who her family was. Knew where did they go or how they managed to survive on their own. But in the end they had 6 kids together. Oh boy, I got great one. My father met/knew my mother from a young age and adopted her. Raised her with his wife, at the time, and her son. Then married her when she turned 18. My grandfather had an alternative family before having my father. That woman took her 2 children, changed their last names, and ran away somewhere out west. No one knows where they are, or are they even alive still. I have a friend whose great-grandfather abandoned his wife and something like 11 kids in Ireland during the famine to move to the US on his own. A bunch of the kids died. Her great-1 grandfather and his brother moved to the US when they were old enough to trace down their dad and unalive him, and apparently they were successful. I feel like some murders are pretty relatable. My grandmother married her second husband entirely for money. Literally the most obvious gold digger people have seen. Her daughters both liked to joke about her intentionally giving him a heart attack. He had heart problems but liked to eat unhealthy food, and the rumor goes she would put extra salt and butter on his food until he finally kicked the bucket. Found out my dad's mom was a lesbian and that my godmother, who lived with both my grandfather and grandmother, was actually her lover. They slept in the same bed while my grandfather had his own room. Growing up I had no idea, but as I got older I pieced it together. But I loved them all and still do. When my father's dad died, the secret was out. Grandpa was an evil man who bootlegged liquor, stole cattle and kidnapped Indian children to sell into slavery. He had a very public mistress, and coming home from a bender he knocked up his wife, my grandma. In order to save face to his mistress, he took the knitting needles to grandma, thus infecting her to die of sepsis in territorial New Mexico in 1929. My dad was 6 with younger brother 4, left to grow up as virtual orphans. Despised by the aunts and forbidden help from their uncles, my dad and his brother grew up in the Depression, almost starving, while their dad lived it up, traveling and committing many crimes that were easy to get away with because it was the Great Depression. My cousin was hit and killed by an 18-wheeler when she was 6. Dude was on his phone when it happened, and they went to court, decided to drop the charges on him, but his company refused to pay them anything for damages caused and whatnot. That's when a few of my uncles, who were a part of Hell's Angels, were buddies with some people on the police force, got this dude's address, unalived him, and then torched the trucking company to the ground. They were never caught. My great-grandfather died in a house fire. Everyone claimed it was all an accident. It turns out he was quite the playboy and was having an affair with married woman. Her husband found out about the little secret and set the whole house on fire while locking them inside. Zero evidence about this and no one investigated, but the said man admitted his crime. My great-grandparents got drunk and locked 2 of my uncles out of the house late at night in the middle of winter. My great-grandparents wouldn't wake up and my uncles couldn't get in, so they tried to walk to their grandma's house that was like 15 miles away, and one of them froze to death and the other had to have his feet and hands amputated because of frostbite. My great-grandparents lied about what happened and said they snuck out that it was in the newspaper and was made out to be this heartbreaking story, about 2 dumb little kids who snuck out in the middle of the night because they wanted to see their grandma. My great-great-grandfather had 2 cousins that got married. Their kids turned out fine, but one of their 3 grandkids was disabled. Years down the line, the disabled grandkid murdered both of the grandparents that were siblings/cousins. He shot them at a family reunion because he felt like they were taking away his parents' attention, or at least that's the story that has been passed down. My grandma and uncle were both diagnosed with cancer in the 90s. My uncle went into remission, grandma died. Almost a decade later, my uncle's cancer came back in full force. He asks my mom for help to take him to the P.O. box as they haven't collected mail in a few days. Mom offers to drive him. When they get back to the house, Mom notices a letter from the IRS addressed to Grandma. Weird, because Grandma hasn't been alive to file taxes in almost 10 years. Turns out Uncle and Grandma had a joint bank account. He never notified authorities of her death. She still got direct deposits from Grandpa's government pension post-mortem, because the government didn't know she was dead. Not only did my uncle illegally receive thousands of dollars of my grandma's pension, he also had several maxed-out credit cards. He knew the cancer coming back was a death sentence and decided to live it up while he was still here. My grandpa can't have kids, but my mother still has 3 siblings.